I was born in London, England. My parents both moved there when they were young. My dad from Jamaica, my mom from Guyana. And that's where my older sister and I were born. I was there until I was about 4.5, and then we moved to Liberia, West Africa, where my parents were missionaries for almost 7 years. So that was, I would say, a huge part of my upbringing. We left there when I was 11, moved to the States, and moved specifically to Andrews, where my dad started seminary. That was actually the first time that I attended an Adventist school. Before that, when I was in Liberia, I was attending a British school and a very international school. And now I started at Ruth Murdoch Elementary School there at Andrews University. And it was an interesting transition, a rough transition in some ways, moving from Liberia to the States. Culturally so different, and it took me a while to adjust, but I did over time. And after being at Ruth Murdoch for 7th and 8th grade, moved just down the street to Andrews Academy, where I was for all 4 years of high school. By the end of that summer, I was back at Andrews starting my undergrad at Andrews University, and that's where I was studying English literature. And once I was finished with that, I moved back home. By that time, my parents were living out in Western Canada. My dad was teaching at CUC there in Alberta. And I wasn't quite sure of my next steps. I knew I wanted to go to grad school, but wasn't sure where. So I decided to take a year off. And I ended up getting a contract teaching opportunity there at CUC. Discovered that I loved teaching, loved the classroom, and I applied to a grad program at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And my big dream by that point was to become a university professor, to teach English literature in a public university. But partway through my master's, I realized, and especially by the end of my master's, that I didn't want to do this. After all, I didn't want to go on and get a PhD. I still love teaching, I love the classroom, I got opportunities to teach while there in grad school. So I figured maybe, somehow I would be a teacher. And one of my professors at the University of Illinois actually said to me one time, "Have you ever thought about going to seminary or, studying theology? Because you managed to weave theology into your papers, somehow. So maybe you want to consider that." And it was really interesting for my professor to say that to me. It's a sort of question you'd perhaps think a pastor asking you, or someone who's a fellow Adventist, or at least a fellow believer. And so it was seemingly very random and yet somehow appropriate, and it helped me to think more about my life and what I was doing in terms of ministry. So once I was home and involved in my local church, a few of us started a young adult ministry at my church, and I was recognizing that the local church setting was a space in which all my gifts were being used, and that for me was really exciting. After being there for a while, my pastor approached me and asked me if I would consider applying for a position that they had available, and they wanted a female pastor. And he said to me, I don't know if you'd get the position because you don't have any theological training, but I'd still like you to consider it, pray about it, think about it, and let me know. And for me, that was confirmation. That was God saying to me, this really is where I want you. And so I made a deal with God that if I didn't get the job, I would go to seminary. And I didn't get the job, and so I went to seminary. When I started seminary, I was all in. I was ready to tackle whatever this meant. And it was during my seminary time that a professor told me about Adventist Christian Fellowship. At that point in time, I didn't know that anything existed in terms of spiritual support for Adventist students who attended public universities. And so I was excited about it. She knew that I'd enjoyed my experience in a public university and that I was passionate about that sphere. And so she told me about this class. I took the class and took more classes the following summer, and now I'm here. I suppose it was a perfect fit. I guess I've never really even thought of it like that. But there is so much from my background that has helped me be ready for this sort of space. You know, I've never been afraid per se of being in a public setting. Growing up in a school that, it wasn't a public school, it was a private school in Liberia, but it wasn't a Christian school. And growing up with all that religious diversity, cultural diversity, you know, you had kids from all over the world there, and culture and difference was celebrated. It was a beautiful thing, and growing up with that and enjoying that has enabled me to, I think, be more comfortable where I am now. One of the things that I think about is the reality that if God can bring me to this point and help me through all that He's helped me through over these last 4.5 years or so, He can do anything. So today has sort of come and is full of a mix of things. I would say it's full of this sense of affirmation that what God has called me to is being affirmed, and for that I'm honestly quite grateful. There are many days when I've wondered if I've called myself to this, and so today for me is a reminder from God that no, you didn't self-call. This is something that I've brought you to. In the good and the bad days, I am here. This is my desire for your life. And there's nothing like affirmation from God. And so it's full of affirmation from Him, and I'm blessed by that, to say the least. It's also full of sort of anticipation, like, so what happens next? I've experienced a lot during this phase of my life. You know, what are you gonna see me through next? I don't anticipate that it will be smooth sailing on all fronts, which is fine, but it's I guess it's a bit of a nervous feeling, an anxious feeling of what's behind those doors. And so yeah, I'm excited by the affirmation, and I'm sort of anxious about, you know, what God has in mind.